That's so frightened. I've never seen her that scared. Wow. How did she get caught in? I have the chair. Got caught in her harness. Yeah.
Like by law, I have to keep that harness on her.
I know, but you can't now.
They're fucking terrible.
Like they're dangerous too sometimes. Well, not by law.
Well, exactly.
She just did. No, she's a working dog.
Hi again, and welcome to everyone watching our live stream on Facebook. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we gather on the unceded ancestral lands of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq of Newfoundland, and that our government continues to lay claims to the land of the Innu and Inuit in Labrador. Colonialism continues to be a tool in the destruction of our environment and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, as evidenced in the poisoning of the Churchill River for a renewable energy project and the violence enacted towards Indigenous families through the residential school and foster care systems, as well as the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people across our country. Our fight to stop climate change must include stopping this violence and recognizing the self-determination of Indigenous nations. Yesterday, the Labrador land protectors were given suspended sentences for 2 years for resisting the destruction of their lands, water, and way of life. Shame! Our legal system is a part of our colonial problem, and that is being used as a tool to silence and suppress them. We encourage everyone to donate to their legal fees fund, as they must retain their lawyer and can be jailed immediately if found on the Muskrat Falls site. Shame!
Shame.
You can find a link to the fundraiser on the Social Justice Co-op Facebook page and Twitter, which is at SJCNL709. SJCNL709. Back to our panel. For the first 30 minutes, panelists will answer prepared questions. These questions can be found on each of your tables, and if you need another copy of the question sheet, please visit the merch table and they'll give you one over there. For the last 30 minutes, we encourage you all to share your perspectives too. Whether you have a question or a comment or a topic you'd like to discuss with the panel, we all have valuable insights to share, so we really encourage folks to get involved in the chat. No question or comment is too silly to answer, and every question and comment is valid. Just raise your hand if you'd like to share something. If you're feeling shy or watching via live stream, you can also text your questions to us at the number 709-730-8389. I'll say it one more time. 709-730-8389, and we'll ask it for you. Our moderator for this evening is Liv Kelly, so I'll hand it over to her to get things going and introduce our panel. Thanks again for being here, and I hope you all enjoy.
Hi everyone. Myself and Erin, our trusty timekeeper, will be your moderators for the evening. The panel portion of the evening will consist of each panelist answering the same 3 questions, which you can find on your table. 2.5 minutes will be given to each question. At 2 minutes, Erin will raise her hand, and again at 2.5 minutes. We have a fabulous panel with us tonight, and we are so fortunate that they are able to take time out of their schedules to speak with us this evening. Now to introduce our panel. First up, we have Luke M. Ashworth, pronouns he, him. Luke is the head of the Department of Political Science at MUN and is an expert on international relations and international political economy. While a member of the MUN-FI Union Executive, he was part of the MUN Climate Coalition. Among the courses he teaches at MUN, the most relevant to the discussions here today is his 3rd-year undergraduate course, The Global Politics of the End of the World, as we know it, where he discusses the various existential threats to our global society, including global heating. Next up, down at the end here, we have Sarah Dunphy, pronouns she, her. Sarah is a 2nd-year psychology student at Dalhousie who is passionate about working with others and does so with groups such as Best Buddies, inclusive choirs, and music programs, and Relay for Life. Sarah is one of the co-founders of Fridays for Future St. John's, and since their movement first started, Fridays for Future has hosted climate strikes with thousands in attendance, met with both provincial and federal officials, and moved the city of St. John's to declare a climate emergency. Sarah recognizes that she still has a lot to learn about the climate emergency and its intersection with other social justice movements, and she is eager and passionate to learn from everyone here tonight. Another panelist we have here tonight is Heather Elliott, pronouns she, her. Heather has a BA in anthropology from Trent University and is currently finishing her master's degree in anthropology at Memorial University, where she studies the effects of gender on the lived experience of people in the maritime sector. She is also the de facto spokesperson for the Coalition for a Green New Deal and has co-authored many letters to the media pushing for greener alternatives in the province. Heather may look familiar to those who saw her on the news last fall when she stood for 11 days outside the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador to protest how sexual assault cases are handled in our highest courts. When not doing school or activist work, Heather writes about maritime history on her blog, Original Shipster, and hangs out at home with her fiancé, dog, and stepson. Our final panelist here tonight is Robert Leamon, pronouns he, him. Robert is a founding member of the Halibut Mi'kmaq First Nation band and was born and raised near Mokdugwek before moving to St. John's, where he still lives today. As a land protector and proud socialist, Robert is passionate about decolonization, tackling the climate crisis, and ensuring economic and food security for all. Standing in solidarity with the land protectors across Turtle Island and around the world, Robert is dedicated to resisting capitalist colonial energy projects that destroy the environment and contribute to ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. In addition to reclaiming his Indigenous identity through activism and performance, Robert strives to build community and inspire activism across social movements on a local and global scale. Robert continues his activism as part of the Social Justice Cooperative, the Anti-Racism Coalition, and the Indigenous Activist Collective. Alrighty, so we're going to get started with our first question. We're going to pass around the mic. Alrighty, so our first question, which we're going to pass on to Luke, is what role does decolonization play in a just transition?
Wow, it would take me a whole course to be able to just answer that one. We'll have 2.5 minutes. Also not helped by the fact that I was going to do a lot of preparation for this beforehand. And before doing the preparation, I thought I'd just check up on the Georgia runoffs. 2 hours later, after watching what was going on in Washington, I realized I hadn't been doing any of this. But anyway, short answer to that is a lot. I think in some respects, colonization is baked into our global political economy. Particularly, I think we can see it when we look at the effects of global heating, and we'll come on to this on the third question as well. The extent to which, even though we call it, the Anthropocene, we say we're all in it together. Of course, there is, deep differences in how the climate crisis affects people, and it is fascinating that, it's horrifying that 20 firms are behind a third of CO2 emissions in the world, and 100 firms are behind over 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a baked-in colonization globally in that sense. I also think as well, and this really comes from, in some respects, from the work of an earlier generation in the 60s, people like Murray Bookchin, is that in many respects there's always been this kind of link between the oppression of humans against humans and the actions of humans on the earth. There's actually a very good book by James Scott called Against the Grain, who explores how the agricultural revolution and the early cities actually created this really quite appalling domination of individuals, whether that be over gender, over race, over class. So in that sense, you know, I think that there is a powerful connection between how we treat the environment around us on the one hand and colonization on the other. And so yes, decolonization, yeah, a lot.
This is in no particular order, but Sarah, what role does decolonization play in a just transition?
Good? Okay, perfect. So, thinking about this question, before I can really talk about this, I think it's important that, you know, myself as a white climate activist and, you know, representing Fridays for Future, which is a largely white-led movement, I don't think it would be fair for me to start this question without saying that we have failed, you know, in centering Indigenous voices in our movement. So I can't speak to decolonization from a higher perspective because we're not doing it well enough. So I need to start with that. If we're talking about decolonization, I think that it is central and so important. First off, because I really think as settlers, it's the kind of the bare minimum really we can do to try to repair the genocide that we've been indirectly and directly perpetrating for centuries. But if we're talking in a climate context, I think that not only is decolonization important, but I really think that it is an asset to the environmental movement because, as Lucien mentioned, industrialization is so linked with colonization, and that really is a major driver of anthropogenic climate change. So I think that decolonization is really going to be central if we're going to listen to Indigenous people who have already figured out how to live sustainably with the land. That's the question we're asking ourselves, but it's already been answered. So I think that decolonization is really going to be quite an asset to the climate movement for sure.
Woo.
Thank you, Sarah. Next up, Heather.
Hello. Similar to Sarah, I had written in my notes that I can't begin to speak on decolonization because I have not personally been the victim of the systems that were designed to oppress myself and my people. There are plenty of communities that have been just absolutely decimated because of the colonial systems that we have here in Canada. It is our #1 priority as activists in any realm, but especially when it comes to climate activism, to center our Indigenous brothers and sisters and speak with them, not for them. A huge problem in activist work and public work in general is you have people who come in with the best intentions for marginalized communities and put in all these programs and all these resources and say, look what we did for you, and the community's like, cool, not what we asked for because you didn't ask us what we needed. So we absolutely need to actually be having clear and transparent consultation with these communities and then doing what we're told. We need to do that. On top of that, I think as individuals, because obviously activism and with Coalition for Green New Deal, you know, personal is political, we need to decolonize our own mindsets. It is so important that we really examine how we have benefited from the systems that are in place and how other people have been oppressed by them and work to undo that programming in our own minds. And I will use myself as an example. So I grew up in Ontario, and there are plenty of First Nations communities in Ontario, but the rhetoric that I learned in school and through the media and through people I knew did not paint these communities in a very, let's say, charitable light, happy light, really good at all, to be honest. And I will fully admit that in my younger years, I was one of those people arguing, well, if they wanted to do better for themselves, they could, they're just not trying. Or, well, if they don't have the resources that they need where they are, why don't they move to the city like the rest of us? Because I didn't know better. Genuinely had no clue how privileged I was and how naive I was and the position that I was speaking from. Didn't have an idea. So I started learning. I actually started reading, I did research, I talked to actual Indigenous people. Whoa, shocking, I know. And figured out that, wow, I was wrong. I was so wrong. And this is the important thing, and we heard a lot of this rhetoric around Black Lives Matter last summer, because yes, we are in 2021, somehow we survived. But it is so important to look at those biases that you carry. Look at those stereotypes that you carry with you. You probably don't realize you have them, but if you do not call them into check, they will bleed into the public work you do, in the private work you do, in the charity work you do, and you will keep making it worse. So the number one thing that we need to do when we are doing this type of activism is we need to start with ourselves, because if we're going in with a broken tool, we're not going to fix anything.
Woo.
And finally, Robert.
Well, Olin, thank you. Yeah, so for the folks in the room who know that I'm the only Indigenous person on the panel and who are wondering why we're like bouncing around the mic and put the Indigenous person last, I asked for that. That was intentional. And that's because I wanted to be able to have this type of conversation that we're happening now, because I've been parts of panels like this before where there's, again, the one Indigenous person and we're asked about decolonization, and they want to center Indigenous voices. It's well-meaning, so they want to put the Indigenous person first, and then every other person on the panel who's not Indigenous just says what they said, and don't meaningfully engage in the humility that it takes to actually admit when you need to pull yourself out of the center of the conversation and actually realize the actions that you need to take for decolonization, and what your role as a non-Native person is in terms of the benefits that you've been able to receive over generations of colonialism, the way that you continue to benefit from that system now. And I especially want to appreciate the humility that Parts of the Future that you brought to this conversation as well, because this has been an ongoing, meaningful relationship to get us to this point now, where we're recognizing, okay, like we haven't done things the way that we should be doing in terms of centering Indigenous voices, but this is the only way that we actually get to the place that we need to be, by being able to have that humility, to have these difficult conversations, and to actually work collectively towards just transition. So in terms of the question of how decolonization plays a role in that just transition, there's no justice. If there's no justice, there is no just transition. Decolonization and a just transition are intrinsically linked. You cannot have a just transition without decolonization. You can't simply greenwash our institutions and say that then everything is fine, we're going to avoid the climate crisis, if we don't first actually address the underlying systems of oppression that continue to commit genocide against Indigenous and racialized people all over Turtle Island and all over the world. Systems of oppression like capitalism, colonialism, racism all must be dismantled before a just transition can truly be achieved. And this isn't just a moral consideration, although it is a very good one. It's human rights, like, come on, people. Right? It's also just a practical one, because the same institutions that are the ones that are supporting white supremacy and genocide and this ongoing colonialism and racism are the same institutions that are perpetuating the climate crisis. Governments keep pouring money into large-scale oil and gas development and other exploitative environmental projects, while continuing to underfund hundreds of Indigenous communities who still don't have clean drinking water, adequate housing, and our police institutions, they defend private property and they defend the petrostate, but they don't stand up for Indigenous and racialized lives. In fact, again, they're actively part of that violence. Thank you, Shane. In Wet'suwet'en, where Indigenous land defenders have been actively resisting the Coastal GasLink pipeline, since only January of 2019, the RCMP has spent more than $13 million in policing Indigenous bodies, in silencing land protection resistors. Imagine if that money had instead gone to supporting Indigenous communities. Near Digby, Nova Scotia, when non-native fishers were being attacked, when Mi'kmaq fishers were being attacked by non-native fishers, and just because they were asserting their treaty rights to fish, as we've all seen this past fall, and the effects of that are still being felt, the RCMP, although they were all there to protect the pipeline, they were not there to protect Indigenous peoples. They stood idly by while our boats were being burned, while we were actively being assaulted, and they're not here for us, they're here for the petrostate, they're here for private property. And in Labrador, as we've already talked about, we've seen how land protectors trying to protect the Churchill River and protect the land from being poisoned, and the people, but from being poisoned by methyl mercury. Again, the police were there to actively drag the people into the courts, into the court system for 4 years now, where they're left with debt, they're left with suspended sentences, and it's a slap on the wrist to say you're not allowed to resist. It's about silencing Indigenous peoples, it's about silencing resistance and upholding the petrostate. The court system is not about justice.
That's right. That's right.
And that's because it's all built on greed. It's the myth of the invisible hand, that we have this unending greed, and that's what's going to what's going to make everything better, and that's what's going to drive everybody forward. But what instead happens is only a select few, those who already have money, the rich, they get to keep pushing things forward in the way that they want to. And anyone who's not already one of their friends or already in the game, they get to actually be pushed further to the margins. And that's what keeps happening. So instead, decolonization seeks to dismantle these institutions, why it is so essential to a just transition. And it's why land back has also been increasing in terms of its popularity, because we've started to see even decolonization become co-opted by those same institutions to say, yeah, you know, we're just going to give more representation to Indigenous peoples. We're going to tweak some things around the margins rather than actually addressing the historic and ongoing systems of oppression that continue to commit genocide against Indigenous and racialized peoples. So land back really gets to that point. It's about returning to the land to the people that were here first, who still have unceded, unsurrendered, sovereign rights to this land, because we still do. We never gave it up. We've been here the whole time. And I just want to leave on this question on defining environmental justice. I want to give a definition that Red Nation offers. They're a coalition of Native and non-Native activists, educators, and students, and community organizers advocating Native liberation. They put it really well by defining environmental justice. Environmental justice is the restoration of land, air, and water, not only as a signal for the return of the land, but also for the return of and demand for justice. Justice is divesting from police and military institutions. Justice is reinvesting in institutions and services that heal our bodies. Justice is creating jobs by reinvesting in healing our planet with clean, sustainable, and traditional options. Long.
Alrighty. For our second question, to our panelists, how do we build consensus to transition out of oil dependence? And you guys can just hand this off in a regular order.
Okay, well, if we're going to talk about consensus and building consensus, the first thing you know is you have to know your enemy. You have to know what you're dealing with. And I don't think you're dealing with denialism. Denialism's a lost cause. The problem we're facing is not denialism, it's delayism. It's people who will tell you, it's like wrestling with a jello. People will tell you, yes, of course we care about, of course we want to get off oil, of course we want a better future for our children. But we still want to carry on the way we are. It's that. Another aspect of it, this is Carrie Marie Norgaard's written on this, a socially organized denial, which is where people are quite accepting of the information about climate science. They know it in the abstract. But there's a disconnect between the political, social, and the private life. And I think this is what we're dealing with. Now, I've got a bit of good news, and part of that good news was the runoff elections in Georgia. This is the way America works. Think about the Second World War. It stays out for a long time, but once it gets moving, it gets moving. And it does seem as though the United States is moving. And there is a global consensus. And that's the sort of the positive news. And that global consensus, as you would expect, because this is a threat against all of us, crosses political boundaries. The one negative thing about that, of course, is that when you've got the finance, the insurance business who all suffer from global warming behind you, they also want a transition that isn't just. So it's now within the group of people who are actually about action that you're going to find the conflicts. And that's where you kind of have to fight for a just transition. But the consensus has to be broad. So I'm optimistic, except about the province. I'm very pessimistic about this province. Because I think this is a serious denialist centre.
Yeah.
But there's a little bit of weird good news, and that is, with if this is expensive oil here, the oil industry will not survive here once the world starts actually dealing with the climate crisis. This is not an industry that's going to survive. The only problem is we should have been preparing for it 20 years ago to get off it in a fiscally, sustainably just way that also guaranteed the jobs of the workers and this kind of stuff. Except the powers that be haven't done that. What they've done is they've dithered, they've assumed they can expand the oil industry, which they can't, and it's going to be a very hard landing. And that's the bad news. And that's where I'm deeply pessimistic.
I think we're going to need new wipes, guys. These are starting to dry out. Safety. So I'm going to answer this question from the perspective of the coalition and kind of the tone that we try to strike when we look at getting our message across to the larger public. The biggest way that you're going to build consensus, especially when you're dealing with people who maybe don't want to hear what you're saying, is making your language accessible. It is very easy when we are in this room and amongst people who all have an understanding of the dialogue that we're having and why these are important, to use terms like just transition. And we all know what that means. But I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine earlier this week and telling them about this panel and gave them the title of the panel, and they looked at me and said, "What's a just transition?" Like, people outside of this scope don't know what those words mean, and so we need to be very mindful when we are getting that message out about why moving away from oil is so important, that we pick and choose our words and our tone very carefully. I know when I'm drafting stuff that's going to be published, I'm very mindful of making sure that any big term, any jargon we use, I explain what it means in my text, because I don't want, the last thing I want is for somebody to read a document and say, "I didn't understand that, this is just a bunch of people getting on with nonsense and carrying on their day." We want them to stop and we want them to listen, and the important way to do that is by minding your message. The other thing to consider is a lot of the people that you're asking to really change, and I'm neglecting, like, we are omitting people in government and in power who do know better and choose to act like they don't from this particular caveat, because they're a whole other kettle of yelling and ranting that I could go off on. When you're dealing with members of the public who aren't on side, who don't necessarily understand that, yes, we do need to move away from oil, you can wear your I love NL oil face mask all day and night long, but it's not going to change the fact that we are moving away from this whether we like it or not. These people are scared. A lot of them have worked in the industry, not just on the rigs and in the fields, but in the offices. They've been fed the same rhetoric that we've heard about, well, yeah, oil's bad, but you know, like, we need to take time. We need something to hold us over as a placemaker while we try to come up with new green technologies. And on the surface, that could seem like a really solid argument if you're not willing to do any critical thinking on the topic. We have to consider how scared these people are, because this is their livelihood we're talking about. We are talking about taking what pays their bills away from them. We saw it with the cod moratorium. It's very similar to that. You need to approach these conversations with compassion and empathy. I also want to close this out by saying I recognize the position of privilege I speak from, because I am a white woman who can speak on these topics from a position of compassion and empathy, and those words have weight. I am not presuming to tell BIPOC individuals who have been detrimentally affected by these systems how they should have that conversation, because those tones are very different, and angry and justifiably so. But the important thing is, when you're looking at it from an organization perspective, as such as I do, I am very mindful of that tone, because I know that I can get that message across effectively in the language that I am able to use.
Yeah, thank you. One of the first things on this question is about building consensus through transition out of dependence, is to actually challenge some of the misinformation that's out there, both being put out by the government and by the oil industry itself. They like to pretend that we have, clean energy, we have clean oil that's cleaner than everywhere else. It's still oil. It's still, we're drilling it out of the ground and burning it and polluting the atmosphere. It's still dirty oil, no matter how clean you like to call it. And similarly, there's this misconception that, well, if we didn't have oil and gas, if they weren't there giving us the money that they have, we wouldn't be able to have any basic services. That the arse is over, there's nothing left in the coffers to be able to fund healthcare, education, or anything else. We just have to bow down and take what we can take from the oil industry. That's also not true. And we know that if we actually take proactive steps and come up with a plan, there are steps that involve taxing the rich, actually getting our fair share of oil royalties while we're still trying to transition off, and so many other solutions that our politicians just choose not to speak to. And in terms of like the idea of like trying to find consensus on this issue, they again like to obfuscate how much consensus there actually is on this issue. So just some stats on this. In 2019, Ipsos found that 71% of Canadians believe the country needs to take the lead globally on fighting climate change, and 76% believe the country needs to be doing more on the issue as a whole. A similar study found in 2019 that a majority of Canadians in every single federal riding believe that the climate is changing. And in 2018, in this province, when asked about what people want to happen in Newfoundland and Labrador over the next 20 years, 69% of respondents said the province should be less dependent on the oil and gas sector. So we know that even the numbers themselves and the people themselves are saying we don't want oil and gas anymore. We need to be doing something better. But so it's not amongst the broader public. Yes, there are still people out there that's going to take time to convince for any number of reasons, either don't know or don't care. But it's mostly the politicians and the institutions that are choosing to obfuscate this, that are choosing to reinforce this same petro-state, and who have been doing so for decades, which lead us to the state that we're in now. So in terms of trying to actually like come out of that and build that type of consensus towards that actual change, it's by building solidarity. It's by working across our movements, and that's why I'm so grateful to see so many coalitions and action teams and everything else coming out through these movements. We've got to learn from Black Lives Matter. We've got to learn from Idle No More and other international movements that take a foundational rights-based approach and build solidarity across our movements. And similarly, we have to offer a vision of a post-oil future that people can see themselves being a part of. And I don't mean that in a way that you need to water down your language or anything else. You have to, there's an absolute right to be frustrated, to be furious about the way that we're currently being treated by our state and by states around the world, and it's important to be able to voice that. But that's again why this solidarity becomes so important, is that certain people can say things in certain ways, other people need to say it in different ways, but if we are all speaking out on these issues in whatever way we can, we might stand a chance.
Woo! So this is a question that we deal with a lot at Fridays for Future, because we have been lucky in being able to come on the stage fairly quickly and get some sort of response out of government officials, whether it be because they know it's a global movement, whether it be because we're young and there's a lot of us. I don't know, I'm grateful anyways. But we struggle with, we have the city has declared a climate emergency. We've met with the Premier, the Environment Minister, the Federal Environment Minister, but nothing has changed. So, building on what everyone has said so far, there's large consensus that this needs to be talked about in some regard, but there's no consensus on if we should even act or how to act. So one approach that I've been trying, not saying that it's worked, but when we're talking about, specifically in Newfoundland and Labrador, inspired by groups like the Social Justice Co-op that are talking about a larger kind of social justice change that encompasses, climate justice that encompasses a lot of different movements. When we think about the province of Newfoundland and look at things like the Come By Chance oil refinery shutting down, and Terra Nova, bringing down its operations, that's an issue, that we need to approach from the lens of supporting the workers who no longer have jobs. I think that maybe we can build a consensus if we agree that, okay, so oil is a finite resource. Besides that, we know that oil companies are starting to shift their priorities and change their exploration processes and stuff like that. So how can we accept that change in the industry while looking at it with a climate justice lens, so that we can support the workers? It's about people as well as, it's not that we're happy Come By Chance closed. We're happy that there's a transition, but not happy that there's no solution for workers, which is a long way of saying I think that if we approach it from a multidimensional lens, that maybe we can get some consensus.
Alrighty, thank you all. For our third question, I'm just going to remind us that we do have a time limit. I know that everybody could speak for hours about this, but we do actually have time restraints, so just be mindful of Erin raising her hand at the 2-minute mark. I don't even know if you guys know that she's over there doing that. So for our next and third final question to the panel, what obligation should heavy polluters have to climate migrants and other problems they're causing? We're going to start over here with Sarah.
So, short answer, big responsibility, in my opinion. When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking a lot about kind of the dichotomy of who are the largest polluters and who right now are facing the largest effects of climate change. And you'll really quickly notice that it's not the same people. It's people in, you know, wealthy Western countries who are, for the most part, who are, you know, contributing in large parts of the climate crisis. It is not these people who are seeing the effects in their backyards. You know, we're dealing a lot with regions surrounding the equator and the high north, the high Arctic, and the south. So people are really able to create this distance, which is not good, because then it's easier to continue to contribute in the way that they are negatively to the environment when you can't see its effects. Yeah, and one other thing I am thinking about with this question is there's over almost 200 nations have signed the Paris Agreement, and you would think that the countries who are the most well-resourced, the wealthiest, would be the ones who are adhering, who are investing in climate solutions, and it's absolutely not. There's 2 countries right now who are adhering to the Paris Agreement. It's Morocco and Gambia, and they are not seen as they're not mass polluters, nor are they viewed as the world's wealthiest countries, but they are countries who are going to be soon and already facing those climate effects. So really, I don't have a good answer for how to get these companies to be accountable, but I think we need to think about the global perspective of who is seeing the effects versus who is contributing. And short answer, yes, I think that large corporations in conjunction with governments are very responsible.
Thank you. So on this question of climate migrants and the responsibility that, you know, the richer states and the corporations have to them, it's important to consider that borders themselves are a colonial construct.
Right.
They're abstract lines.
Right on.
They're just abstract lines that they decided to paint on a map, just, you know, took out a drawing, drew a few lines, and said, no, you're in and you're out. And they picked it based on, okay, these are the people that we like, and these are the people that we don't care if they survive.
Right.
And that's what's currently happening with the climate crisis, is that, you know, they've drawn borders to say we're going to protect some people and we're going to exclude everyone else, and pretend that they're going to look for these loopholes and say, well, that's another country whose climate agreement, they haven't followed their part. We're doing our part, but they're not doing theirs. But when you consider the fact that this is a global crisis, that this is global climate chaos that's happening, it only takes a couple big countries that are big polluters to do damage to everybody else, and those are the people, the ones who aren't leading the pollution, who are actually feeling the displacement and burden. And we know that they're going to continue to refuse climate migrants at the border, that they're going to refuse to keep helping people in other countries, because they're already doing that. We're already putting up barriers to immigration that are way too high, even in the best of times. So now that we're going towards climate migrants, we're seeing already people aren't being able to be supported. They could be, but states are actively choosing not to. And we're also seeing it in our own backyard. We're seeing indigenous communities in Canada who are already actively displaced for very similar reasons, that the state is very much, you know, we're going to move forward on pipelines or on a paper mill or on any other, or a hydro dam or any other type of environmental project. They've been doing this for hundreds of years, where they've just railroaded over anybody else's rights for the advancement of the energy and everything else. So in terms of actually trying to figure out who's responsible for this and how we deal with it, we the rich. Land is a social relationship, and we need to learn how to share it.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, definitely, like both of the speakers before me have said, they need to be held accountable. It's tricky, unfortunately, because a lot of these companies need governments to put them in check. They've operated with impunity because governments have allowed them to do so, and don't want to be the bad guy to stand up against industry and say, no, you can't do that, and we're actively going to stop you. So we need companies to be held accountable, but we also need governments that are willing to do that. And that's a big problem. It's a problem we see here in Newfoundland right now, in so many different industries. And we were actually having this conversation at the table before this session started about how frustrating it is to have governments that will preach green policy and say, well, we have all of these, you know, systems in place, and we have these regulations, and these things have teeth, and these things can, yeah, they have teeth if you use them. A dog has teeth, but if the dog chooses not to bite you, then the teeth don't really matter now, does it? So really what we need is, it is twofold. We need to hold the companies and the industries accountable who are poisoning the air, who are causing the climate crisis, who are polluting, who are causing small communities and communities in the global south to have to evacuate their homes because their homes are uninhabitable. And we need governments who are willing to actually stand up and say, hey, you know what, we're actually going to hold ourselves to the Paris Agreement. So it's, and again, this comes back to our previous question about consensus. If we all keep saying the same thing in whatever voice we have, they have to listen eventually. That's literally my answer. It's very short.
Great, well, saw this question, and the first thing I thought of was, I suppose as we all do, is compensation. Yeah, okay, that's a good first step. Problem with compensation, though, in some respects, I mean, it's important, and quite often people who are victims of something ask for compensation, and quite rightly that they should. Problem with compensation, though, is it's kind of throwing money at the problem, isn't it? It keeps the hierarchies in place. It doesn't change the world. We go back to the way we were. We've just compensated those that we've hurt. And I was thinking, really, that the obligation we should have is, of course, to change the world. If we make the world fairer, then the damage we have done to other people don't matter, because we compensate them by making the world fairer, making us more equal, making it better. But I think there's the rub. That is probably our obligation. But I'm reminded of a line, it shows up in one of Frederick Jameson's books. Isn't it interesting? It's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Wow.
We don't seem to be able to get our mind. We can watch an apocalyptic film. We can talk about climate change and the effects it's going to have. But we can't imagine a new world, a new system. That's probably the most difficult task we have facing us, is to invent, imagine, to dream a new world. And in fact, I think, it's what we're facing now, because societies, civilizations, ways of doing things usually collapse under the own weight of their contradictions well before they're replaced. There's a line, it's a misquote from Gramsci, but it's a good one, which is that the old world is dead, the new world has yet to be born, this is the time of monsters. It isn't just 2020 that's been the problem. We've been in this situation for a long time. The old world's died. That's the optimistic bit. The big problem is we haven't yet imagined a new world. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Got shivers. It's so powerful. Alrighty, we're gonna open up the floor to our panelists and, to the audience actually. So if anyone has a question that they've been dying to ask either a particular member of the panel or the whole panel, is there anyone that's interested in doing so? Okay, I see someone at that back corner table there, in the black. Can you put on a mask and come on up here? Let's hear it for my boyfriend, Zach. Woo!
Okay. to ask originally, like, do you think the climate crisis could be solved under capitalism? Well, you guys have nailed that. So my backup question is, what do you, like, how important do you think individual choices are in solving the climate crisis?
Oh God. Well, I still think we should do those things, but really, this is the thing about human society. Hell, I'm a social scientist. Things only get done when people organise. It happens in groups.
Right.
It happens through organisation. Terrible things happen through human organisation too. We've just watched it happening in Washington just recently. But it really is about organisation. And I think, there's a great line from my colleague in geography, Max Leveron, talking about recycling. And, she's not saying don't recycle, please do. But she said, it's a band-aid on gangrene. There really does have to be action, which is why I think the second question we were asked was so important, that issue about building consensus. And building consensus outside our own ideological bubbles, too. It's important, it's crucial.
Yeah, I think individual choices are obviously important because we need to do what we can, and I don't know if anybody else saw the NPR article about how recycling is just a big old lie. That's part of the problem. It's one of the best things that the big polluters did was ever pass the buck of saving the world onto individuals and making us think that if we just, recycled our tin cans and composted, that somehow we individually would be able to solve the climate crisis. Me having a composter in my backyard is not going to undo the literal billions of pounds of carbon being pumped into the atmosphere. That's just not going to happen. So I think individual action is important because it sets a precedent. It gets us into a habit of thinking more cleanly and thinking more green. But it's not going to actually solve the problem. For that to happen, we need to actually hold the people who are doing the damage to account and make them stop.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I find it interesting that the first question was about, can we actually find, a just transition under capitalism, and then asked about, well, what do individual actions make, or what differences do they make? Because I actually see them as being a very linked question, in that the idea of the individual being able to do something to solve the climate crisis, rather than being part of a whole community, rather than being part of this whole global conversation, that the myth of the individual is something that was very much taught to us by capitalism, and is again meant to keep us from actually coming up with those broader community and system-wide changes, because they're again passing the buck over onto the individual. And on this, I want to also note the way that not only have individuals been taught to separate themselves from the broader society, humans have also been taught to separate themselves from the broader environment. As if humans are this, deity up here, and every other living or non-living thing on this planet is just some resource to be exploited, that land can just be chopped up and handed out to other people for the benefit of humanity. That is not what humanity should look like. That is not what people should be doing, because we are all part of Mother Earth. We are all here on this planet together, and if we're not in it together, then we're not going to last long.
So I really like this question. I was really interested in it because the whole reason I ever started doing anything with the environment is because I decided 2 years ago that I was going to be zero waste. I'm not. Spoiler alert. That's very difficult. But I came to environmentalism and climate action through being inspired to take individual action, and I now realize the significance that corporation and government have in this movement. However, and this is a question that came up when I asked my parents to buy an electric car. We didn't. It's difficult in Newfoundland and quite expensive. But I, at the same time, believe that while we are doing the larger work, if you are in a position of privilege to be able to do things like reduce your individual waste and individual carbon consumption, I think if you're in a financial place of privilege or geographical place of privilege, I think that there is a bit of, I think that markets will respond because of their nature, greed. I think that they will respond to big enough change. I think it's happening already. It's very greenwashy, you know, but I think that it is happening already. So I think that it's not, you know, I don't think that individual action is how we're going to solve the climate crisis, but I certainly think that it's how we might inspire some changes. And if we're privileged enough to be able to make changes, I think it also is just, it feels good to be able to live a bit more kind of green.
Alrighty, did we have another question at the back of the bar there? Yeah? Do you want to come up and ask your question? Thank you. We also have a couple questions over text, I believe, so make sure you send them. What's the number again? 730-8389. If you have any questions, text them. Or come up and ask.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists tonight. My question is kind of a two-parter, but so my question is, do you believe that a just transition requires democratic reforms to enact, kind of building on the consensus question? And given the incredible influence that oil industry and its benefactors have in shaping public policy, if that is required, how can we best incorporate decolonization in that process?
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, democracy is essential. And it's actually interesting that UK just went through, I mean, the UK's been going through a little bit of a kind of a complete nervous breakdown at the moment. But weirdly, it's actually doing really well on the climate side of things. Perhaps, you know, we could do better, but it's actually doing well. One of the things they had done, well, of course, was to have this big, the government helped organise this forum, this kind of people's assembly on climate action and climate change, and it was quite groundbreaking. And, you know, it's something I really miss. When our government here decides to do something about the economy, it goes and hires a group of people, it sticks in a star chamber. Headed by someone who's not even living in France.
Exactly.
And you know, nothing against them, they're probably, you know, wonderful people, but the point is, it's not very democratic. Yeah, I'm trying to be nice. But you know, so I think that democracy is essential, and we really kind of need a lot more of that when we're dealing with this. I don't want to monopolise this. I know there's a second question there, but maybe I'll leave that for someone else.
I'm pretty sure if we let you, you just keep going. It's
Yeah.
great. It's absolutely great. I think democracy is necessary. I think that we need to actually start governing in a way that benefits our people instead of what benefits industry.
Yeah.
And that is something in particular I find very frustrating in Newfoundland, is that the needs and well-being of the people and the constituents seems to be put at second priority, and the needs and the desires of large industry go to the forefront, and that is problematic for me. So in terms of any type of democratic reform, it would be to actually have a government that operates democratically, as in for the people, and not just for the people who are signing the checks. How decolonization works into that is, as we've touched on, you know, our marginalized populations are the ones who need the most help. Our Indigenous communities are the ones who need the most support. And if we are operating within a system that continues to uphold these colonial ideas that their land is there, as Robert said, to be cut up and just handed out in the name of humanity, we're not really doing our job. So I think centering and elevating those voices, listening to what they need, and using those insights as a leading point to really push forward and start pushing back against larger industry so that our people benefit from government is what we need from our people in power.
Thank you. Yeah, so on the question of democratic reform, absolutely going to be essential in order to get. I think there's still steps that we can take and there's still changes that we can make without democratic reform if we're forced to, because we know that democratic reform is one that has been a hard nut to crack for a very long time. For the last 10 to 15 years, you can look at it that there's about $500,000 or so that is given to the party that's going to win the election, and it's all from corporate interests who want to make sure that they've got a seat at the table once that premier and once that government forms power. So then, we keep seeing new governments that are just about, okay, who donated the most? And while they're in the office, okay, how can I make sure that they don't donate to me again? And it becomes less about that consensus seeking, and that's how a lot of these systems reinforce themselves. So yes, democratic reform is absolutely part of that. And decolonisation is definitely part of that too. Indigenous people have long been, proud stewards of the land and land and water defenders, and have actively protected the land for the next 7 generations, because that's one of the distinct differences too, is that our current system only thinks about the right now, it only thinks about the next election, it doesn't think about what it should be thinking about, which is how do we make sure that we still have a planet left for the next generation, for the 7 generations to come ahead. And land back.
I don't really have anything to add. This was more a learning opportunity for me, but I enjoyed it.
Alrighty, Erin's going to read out a question that we received over text.
Alright, so this is an anonymous question for anyone on the panel who would like to answer it. And it's imposing carbon taxes on larger companies has been ineffective, as many of them view it as part of doing business. What is the next step that we the people need to push government to do to hold heavy polluting companies accountable for their environmentally damaging actions? Do we need to make a larger push for rebates, since money clearly drives these companies?
Anybody want to answer that one in particular?
Just gonna hand it down again.
Sorry, Luke.
It's okay. It's no worries. Yeah, I'm going to do a two cheers to the carbon tax on this one here. I mean, there are major problems, and don't get me started on problems to do with carbon taxes. But the only thing I'd say on that one is that it really does depend how well it's done. It can be part of a transition, and a just transition. And in some respects, it is speaking the language of many of these companies. I mean, basically what we have done is we have subsidized a lot of industries by giving them free refuse collection. They can just pump it in anywhere they like. And I think one of the things about putting a price on it is that it kind of removes that subsidy. Again, it's not the only thing we can do, but I think, and again, I think ironically, the carbon tax has done a lot of grief from the right, but this is actually a very conservative, very market-friendly solution. It's not radical. So it's actually very strange that it's come under attack from the right in Canada, because you would have thought this would be the one. Instead, actually, we've got the Conservatives talking about a plan which seems to be, even though it's got no teeth, the last election, seemed actually a little bit closer to kind of a command economy. So we've got Conservatives talking about sort of command economy solutions. And we've got kind of the left talking about a market-friendly solution. So there's an interesting kind of turnaround there. But anyway, maybe one cheer for carbon taxes.
I don't know that more rebates is the answer. I know that it does speak the language that these businesses like to speak, but it also means we're pumping more money into, we're basically just lining the pockets of the people who are doing the damage, and really giving them more money to be able to monopolize green technology so we can have this same fight in 15 years. So no, I think removing subsidies, any subsidies that are in place entirely for large carbon emitters would be, radical. But in my mind, just makes sense. I don't know why we're paying people to poison us. That continues to baffle me. So if nothing else, as the people just pushing for government to continue to extract themselves from these issues and to stop putting money into these industries because they run really expensive operations. And if they have to start actually footing the full grand total, 100% of the bill, they may be incentivized to stop it. That's all. Woo!
Yeah, so in terms of the question of the carbon tax, like we've already said we need to move past capitalism. So a carbon tax is just going to be one tool that works within that type of capitalist system and therefore does not work. Because it does not actually address the root issue, which is the greed and never-ending growth that our colonial capitalist system likes to tell us is how we actually need to move forward. So, assuming we're stuck with capitalism for the next few years, then sure, the carbon tax is a good, mostly good, sometimes good initiative, only if the money that's coming from that carbon tax and being collected is actually being put towards green initiatives that are meaningfully and adequately funding a green transition. That's the other problem with the carbon tax in the current way that it's being done, is that there's no guarantees that where that money's going to go. And we've seen it go towards more election spending or any other types of projects that are not what they're intended to be for. So, no.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add to this. As I was thinking about the question and listening to the panelists, it made me think of a small and maybe silly comparison to make, but it made me think of when probably I was a kid and there was a small tax incorporated on using plastic bags at the grocery store. Nobody stopped using plastic bags at the grocery store. They, as said in the question, they just accepted it as a price of doing business or as a price of going to the grocery store. A small inconvenience of like 15 cents maybe. Nothing that's going to go out of your way. And I think that in some ways can kind of be extended to a much more nuanced issue of a carbon tax, and that as the question, framed, I really like that way of framing it, is that that's just going to be seen as another business expense, another price of doing business. So I really do think that it's not going to be, it's more going to be legislative and changes in how corporations are operating instead of expenses that they have to incur. That's going to hopefully cause some changes.
I'm going to open up the floor for one more final question. If anyone has, yes, you at the bar, would you like to come up and speak, or do you want to shout it out if you think you're loud enough? Yeah, you want to come up and speak?
Actually, simple.
Okay.
I'd like to hear what is decolonization from the planet.
Okay, so the question is, what is decolonization? That is a very good question.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Is it fair if I say we hand this question to Robert?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. I know we can talk for 2 minutes about it.
I'll take it first this time.
Go.
So decolonization comes out of a lot of language around like reconciliation, and it looks at the colonial state as it exists now and says, hey, we're doing a lot of things wrong, let's give it back to indigenous peoples, let's actually remove the colonial pieces and the colonial influence, like the courts, like the police system, and like any of these other types of government systems, and adequately recognizes that indigenous peoples still have sovereign rights to this land, and we need to take active steps towards restoring those sovereign rights and making sure that those are upheld and enacted. One of the issues with decolonization that's happening now is that, as I said before, it's becoming because it does sound a bit more academic, because it is a bit, and it's often talked about in those types of circles, it is being kind of co-opted again. Similar to how reconciliation has been co-opted, we've seen over the last 5 years a number of reports come out, so like step-by-step instructions about how you address these types of issues, and governments continuing to do nothing about them. Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry since then, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and those are just the 3 off the top of my head. There's so many more types of these types of studies that talk about how you can get to decolonization, and that's why earlier I mentioned land back. Is one that a lot of people are talking to, because it really speaks to the very heart of the issue, is give the land back.
Thank you, Robert. Alrighty, I think that is it for our panelists. I'm going to hand this off to
Marie. All right.
Okay, wow. Thank you, everybody. Can we get one more round of applause for our amazing from the three organizations, the Social Justice Co-op, Fridays for Future, and the Coalition for a Green New Deal, thank you guys so much for speaking and for your kind and wise words. It really means a lot that you guys come and talk to us today. Luke, Heather, Robert, and Sarah. Thank you guys so much. Yeah. I'd like to take this opportunity, well, we thank the panelists, and I'd also like to thank the moderators, Lilith and Aaron, as well as all the volunteers and staff who have made this night happen. Lastly, thank you to all of you guys for coming out. We wouldn't be here if there was no one here who wanted to listen. So thank you for coming to our event, and we look forward to these that happen every month. If this floats your boat and you liked tonight, these happen the first Wednesday of every month. Next month's event will be hosted by the Zero Waste Action Team, so stay tuned for details on the topic. If you have any questions or ideas for a future Green Drinks topic, please reach out to socialjusticecoopnl@gmail.com. I'll say it one more time. socialjusticecoopnl@gmail.com. We're always glad to hear from you. And we'll draw for our not one but two cake winners at 9 o'clock. So be sure to get your tickets ready. If you don't have them yet, pop over to the merch table. You can also pick up some cool merch there, all kinds of things to spend your money on if you'd like. It's not too late. See you soon for the draw. And thanks again to Gemma and Anne for the beautiful cakes. My notes say to ask Leah to bring up the cakes to show. Are you? Yeah. Leah's gonna display beautiful cakes. Yes. Wow, Leah's coming up. We're drawing for these beautiful cakes at 9. You guys, this cake, what kind of cake is it? This is a vanilla cake, and then this cake, what kind of cake is it?
Red velvet, vanilla ganache.
Red velvet, chocolate ganache. I know. That's pretty deadly. You could win a vote, so get your tickets. See you at 9.